Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Daniel Bessner. Daniel, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Aria. My name is Daniel Bessner, and I'm a guest today of you.
Well, welcome back on it. You're probably one of my top five all-time guests in
Oh,
terms of
it's probably me and
appearances
David, like
at this
David
at this
Cleon.
point. You've racked them up. Um, so we are going to be talking about the cover story that you wrote for Harper's Magazine in May. People can check the link. The Life and Death of Hollywood is the title of the article. I thought it was really interesting. Congrats on getting a Harper's cover article again.
Yeah, it's
And
my second in less than 2 years.
yes, that's impressive. Um,
Very impressive.
so I know you as someone who's a professional historian of American intellectual history and someone who's very interested in foreign policy. Um, and so it was somewhat surprising when I saw that you are writing this article. How did this come together? And why did you want to write this?
Yeah, sure. It's actually not as surprising as you think because my work is in some sense concerned with intellectuals in the 20th century, and writers are a type of intellectual, and I've done a lot of reading and to some degree writing about other forms of intellectuals besides just those involved with foreign policy. My first book, of course, was on these defense intellectuals who helped, found the national security state. But so it's not as far as it might initially appear. So basically, I was in Hollywood or LA rather for a sabbatical. I became friends with a lot of writers. Started, dipping my toe into screenwriting myself, and I was
Oh,
there
okay,
over the
interesting.
strike. Yeah, and so I was there over the strike, and the more I learned about the business, I'm like, oh, this is kind of a fucked up business. Really doesn't benefit the writing side of the equation. So I wanted to kind of look at how that developed over time, how we got to the structure we got to today, kind of using the strike as kind of a lead.
Right, and you're focusing on TV and film writers in particular,
Yeah.
but talking about the business, or most of the people you interview are TV and film writers. Yeah. So was the angle that you yourself were getting interested in it, and sort of writers are the intellectuals of Hollywood, or
No, it really. I just wanted to, it was another thing I should have added. That's a good reminder, is that also journalism and academia are two writing fields that have been destroyed as well. So I was interested in getting into how these larger capitalist processes that in particular destroyed journalism and academia is related, but kind of a different story, but how those are playing out in Hollywood until recently a relatively robust business that seemed to have totally gotten, undercut in the last decade or two. So that was also another inspiration for it.
so if there's a villain of the piece, I guess it's capitalism, but a more
Yeah.
recent
The villain of the piece is definitely capitalism.
uh,
Are you an anti-capitalist yet? Or do you
you
still
know,
think
I,
capitalism is
I'm
good?
I'm still I haven't joined DSA. I don't think my essential beliefs about capitalism have changed that much in recent years. But certainly, private equity seems to be a baleful force in the country, the culture, the economy at large, and any industry moves into it gets
So all
worse.
industries.
And so private equity has become much more enmeshed with Hollywood over the past 10 or 20 years. And you tie this in part to deregulation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so basically Hollywood was pretty regulated from the late 40s until the early 80s. People might have heard of the studio system. That was basically a political economic structure where writers and actors were on salaries for studios. That lasts roughly from the 20s until the late 1940s. During that time, actually, the proto WGA, or not even proto, the pre WGA, just the institution that came before it was renamed the WGA, the Screenwriters Guild, was created as an official union. The writers had signed their first contract with the studios in 1942. But in 1948, the Supreme Court issues these things called the Paramount Decrees because the studios were vertically integrated. They controlled production, distribution, and exhibition.
because
in effect,
they owned theaters, like
they own the production apparatus, they own the distribution apparatus. You know, it's actually kind of difficult to send around movie film strips around the
mm,
country to it's a complex system distribution. And then they also own the exhibition, which is the movie theaters that exhibited these movies. You know, of course, Netflix now owns all three, and most studios now do too because of the deregulation. But so in effect, due to lobbying, from what I remember, from actually smaller studios, in 1948, at least partially due to that lobbying, the Supreme Court issued these things called the Paramount Decrees, which essentially ordered the studios to get rid of some aspect of their business so that they couldn't be monopoly in production, distribution, and exhibition. And most of them, I think all of them, actually got rid of their exhibition businesses, the movie theaters, because they really concluded that they were primarily in the business of distribution. That was their major business. So this happens, and as the studios become less flush with cash over the course of the 1950s, you see the slow erosion of the studio system structure. So you see the replacement of salaried employees with freelance workers. In 1960, the WGA and SAG went on strike at around the same time, and as a result of that strike, they were basically able to get, you know, kind of an ersatz structure of a career. The studios agreed to do things like pay residuals for movies that were rebroadcast on TV. Not all movies, certain movies after a particular that were made after a particular time, and also for TV shows that were rerun on after they were initially aired, and not, you know, at the time it wasn't forever. There were certain limits on what one was paid, but in addition to that, the studios agreed to pay health benefits and pension benefits. So you get basically the establishment in mid-century of America where, you know, if you were working for DuPont, you had a pension and stuff like that. And health benefits, you get that established in Hollywood, even though basically the structure is now a structure of freelancing.
mhm.
That is in effect the system that has defined Hollywood since 1960.
So the studio system is sometimes like called like the golden age of Hollywood, and that's, you know, uh, Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz and Casablanca and movie classics were produced in that era, and yeah, and so the actors and the writers were on contract, and that had uh, positive and negative effects. And I think in retrospect is seen for at least the actors as being very exploitative because, you know, a young star would be signed to like you know, a contract for a certain length of time would have to make the movies the producers ordered, had little power. They often were, if the women were sexually exploited. Um, so then, like the ending of the studio system, the fact that stars were no longer under contract, you know, in sort of like the one version of the narrative is like a good thing because,
Yeah, it's
um,
complete bullshit. I mean, you would want the protections of an actual industry without the sexual abuse and exploitation. Um, I mean, that's just nonsense. It's absolutely worse to be a freelance worker unless you're Shonda Rhimes or Ryan Murphy. There's just no question about it. I mean, this is like, it's not even debatable. It's much better to have steady work and a steady salary as opposed to, you know, you get one guest spot on One Tree Hill in 2002, and that's basically it. It just creates a more stable system. It creates a lot more production. It creates oftentimes, if not always, more interesting productions. Not again, not always. I mean, most art most of the time is bad. But it wasn't all defined by intellectual property in the way that it is today.
so
I
so
just think that's a
you
nonsense
think
argument.
you think the economic system of the studio
I
system
mean, also, like, I
was
gotta,
better? Well, what do you
Aria,
think it
wait,
was
hold
better
on.
for, and who do you think it was
I
worse
hate
for?
to break it to you, but there's still exploitation in Hollywood,
Of
even
course, of
after the
course.
decline of the studio system,
But
as
there
the
were
entire
things that
Me Too
happened where,
movement
like, you know, Jack
demonstrated.
Warner would acquire the contract for, I'm just, you know, using these names randomly, Ava Gardner or something, and like force her to change her name, get her teeth capped, and
Same shit
star
happened on
star
same
at a
shit
certain
happened with Harvey Weinstein. I mean, it's the
right. So
exact
there's
same
always
thing.
been
Yeah.
monstrous
Yeah.
producers, and
Yes.
some
Yes.
great
Yes.
movies were made, and I mean, pretty much I think throughout there's been, well, the connection between quality and the economic system of Hollywood is not simple.
Well,
So
no
there were
one's
great
really done the
movies
work,
and
right?
tons of garbage that no one remembers that was put out during the system.
Yeah.
Who do you think the
Most art is bad.
who do
Like,
you
I mean,
think
that's
right?
just a
Who do you
fact.
think the studio
Yeah.
system was bad for?
I mean, still labor was exploited because we lived in capitalism. I mean, but at least you had a stable profession. This is like a lot of the issues of the mid-century political economy have been written about, you know, like all those mid-century male authors talking about stifling office environments and gray flannel suits and all that stuff. So that was also, you know, not perfect. But yeah, I mean, it's all going to be bad if it's ultimately under capitalism. It's just worse or better.
Okay, I agree with that more or less. But so part of the studio system was also because of the monopoly, the the studios had a ton of money, and
Yeah.
some of that excess money went into you know building nice mansions in Southern California, and some of it went into making masterpieces, and then some of it went into making
Well,
things
there
that
was
was
less of a,
crap
I
that no
mean,
one remembers now.
there was
Um,
also a culture of capitalism, and I don't want to overstress this, but like the idea was you grow your business and that like you do think about the medium and long-term health of something
right,
called the entertainment industry. And that has really gone away, where it's all about short-term profits, it's all about pleasing financial overlords, it's all about the next hit. So there was a different time horizon, a bit of mid-century capitalism and 21st century neoliberalism, sort of the difference between a Fordist political economy and a neoliberal political economy. That was an appreciable difference. But again, I don't want to overstress. Again, most art is bad. You know, like
right.
sometimes you get Casablanca, most of the time you get like hundreds of forgettable shit movies that no one remembers. That many of which maybe they were good, but they were melted down when the studios melted down their film strips to sell, I think it was silver at some point to, you know, to try
Oh,
to
the
make up
colloidal
some money.
silver, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So they did that at some point, I believe in the 60s, to, you know, make up some shortfall. So it's not like they were such like amazing purveyors of culture.
Right. It's sort of like,
Either.
things that are great bubble up. Like within a monopoly system, sometimes greatness can emerge, and most of the time, like mediocrity will emerge. But yeah, most things are,
Well,
most
I
creative
think they're
efforts are mediocre more or less.
yeah, I mean, but I think a big difference in terms of content that we could point to, there was much less interest in pre-existing intellectual property and creating franchises, right? So you would get more original work, even though a lot of the greatest films of all time, and The Maltese Falcon, and I even believe Casablanca, I believe it's based on a play, were, you
Right.
know,
Was
pre-existing
Ravaz, Gone with the
intellectual
Wind were both
property.
novels.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah.
and
So
there was
there's
also a closer connection between like hiring, William Faulkner or
yeah.
F. Scott
Well, those
Fitzgerald to
worlds
actually
have
come and
totally
be on
just
contract.
yeah, sort of the high literary worlds in Hollywood are they were connected in a real
Right.
way at the mid-century. In a way they just aren't any longer.
Have you seen oh, the name is the Coen Brothers movie about the Clifford Odets figure? It's just going out of my mind.
Barton Fink?
Yeah, Barton Fink. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
a,
yeah.
that's a a satire on this era where they get a Clifford Odets style socialist playwright, bring him out to Hollywood, give him all this money, and say you should write a wrestling picture.
Right.
And
Right.
there's a William Faulkner parody as well, and I don't know why that popped in my mind, but it was sort of like, yeah, there's so much money slopping around this system that you could put a young player on retainer and have them produce like something everyone knew was crap, and they were still making money um, in the end. So okay, the big screen golden age was like that era, and then we had a golden age of television that you and I lived through that was sort of
Mhm.
like late '90s aughts to
Totally.
early 2010s or mid 2010s. What facilitated that, and why was like TV different
Yeah.
than movies?
I mean, this is the irony of deregulation. Initially, deregulation did pump money into the system, unleashing those famous capitalist energies that people were talking about in the 1970s and 1980s. And one of the consequences of this was the deregulation of cable. And so you got over the course of the 80s and 90s the emergence of a lot more cable stations. And so one of the ways that you know, these companies tried to distinguish themselves was through scripted content. And this actually cable had scripted content going back to its earliest moments, but it really began to take off in really in the late 1990s. Famously, people talk about the Sex and the City, which I believe debuted in 1998, and The Sopranos in 1999. But there's a bunch of other networks that are doing it. Showtime does it, Lifetime does it, in particular does script and content. And so one of the things that these cable stations were trying to do is to get people to watch them. And
Because there's
so
a subscription service on top of a subscription service.
right for HBO and Showtime, not Lifetime, but
Right.
but yeah. So pay cable is what it's called. Pay twice cable because you already paid once. But these networks would give relative creative freedom to creators. And also they wanted to do sorts of different types of television in order to distinguish themselves, and probably because they also liked good art. So you have people like David Chase or David Milch or David Simon, who had been working in television for a long time and who knew how to write good TV, but were kind of the shackles of network television were taken off them, and they were allowed to do really interesting projects like Milch, Deadwood, and Simon, all these Davids, The Wire,
The
and
Wire, yeah.
Chase, The Sopranos, and later Vince Gilligan with Breaking Bad, and also the first season of Homeland and Girls. So like interesting projects. But of course, over time, guess what? Capitalism is fundamentally interested in making money. And so once you got this turn to streaming in the late aughts and early 2010s, partially as the result of technological advances, but partially because after the Great Recession, the Obama administration, in all of its wisdom, decided to pump capital into the system, and so and lower interest rates. So you got gigantic financial institutions were able to really enter Hollywood, and so they were entering a Hollywood that by the late aughts had been basically defined by a resurgence of monopolization. I think this was actually your first question, so let me get back to it. So Reagan comes in the 1980s, and he begins the deregulation of the American economy. And one of the places that he deregulates is Hollywood. And in particular, it was Reagan's FCC, or it was the DOJ actually. The DOJ and the FCC together basically determined that they weren't going to enforce existing antitrust law. So you get the emergence of gigantic conglomerates over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, famously made fun of in 30 Rock, where like NBC was actually owned by Scheinhardt Wigs, right? Today,
Right,
NBC is
right.
actually owned by Comcast. So there are these
Didn't they
gigantic,
predict that because because they had Cabletown, yeah, which was ultimately owned by the Scheinhardt Wig Company. But
right.
did Cabletown did that purchase happen before Comcast, or was
Yeah,
that
yeah,
just
Comcast
making fun of
happened.
Comcast?
Yeah. I believe it happened before I would have to see what season,
30
but
Rock has become bizarrely prescient about
well,
various rude things.
she was in the belly of the beast, right? She was seeing it happen. She worked
Yeah.
at SNL and then she worked further at NBC, and she's obviously Tina Fey is obviously very smart, and saw what was going on. It was a great joke. But anyway, so you get high finance and entering a basically like conglomerated Hollywood. And so you get this feeling of a gold rush over the course of the 2010s, where the streaming networks, first with Netflix, which is still today really the only successful streaming network, makes a lot of money, succeeded in its play to become the monopoly, basically the Amazon of television. Netflix actually did kind of do that. It became the Uber of television. But in the mid 2010s, all these other companies, the legacy studios, tried to copy them. You get Disney Plus, HBO Max, Peacock, Paramount Plus, and basically they all failed. But they still, at the time, needed television. And so when there was low interest rates and high finance entered into the business, you got the spending on a lot of more shows. However, and more work on this remains to be done. My understanding and my supposition is that actually, while the number of shows increased, the number of episodes over the course of the 2010s probably didn't increase or increase very much,
Mhm.
because episode orders for like a Law and Order would be 22. But when you're looking at like one of these streaming networks, they would be, 6 to 8 episodes. So the number of episodes probably didn't increase. And you basically see over the course of the 2010s, even though it felt like a gold rush, the erosion of a lot of the protections that had defined writing in television. Residuals aren't paid or weren't paid on streaming. You get the rise of these things called mini rooms, which were actually initially created by cable networks like AMC and Stars to compete with the richer cable networks, because they weren't able to do a lot of development They didn't have the money, so they would actually do shorter times of development. That model was then turned towards streaming, because also streaming, it seems like they cared less about the product. They just wanted to have a constant churn of new shows to get people subscribed, because the gamble was like Uber, right? You would lose money for a decade by giving people cheap access to a product, and oh wait, now there's only Uber, there's no more taxis, and we're gonna explode our prices. That was kind of the plan with cable. So you get the erosion of the writer's life, far fewer residuals if you're on they had like a pseudo residual, but basically no residuals if you're on streaming, much less pay, much because you're working for a shorter amount of time. And so this is basically the conglomerated and financialized Hollywood eroded the writer's life, which helps give rise to the strike, which happens in May 2023, and then the actor strike, which happens shortly thereafter.
So you start the piece talking with a woman named Elena Smith.
Elena Smith, yeah.
Elena Smith, who is the creator of this show Dickinson, which I haven't seen because I don't subscribe to Apple Plus, but was sounded quite unusual, was critically lauded, and is about the poet Emily Dickinson, but has like supernatural or time traveling or something aspects to it, that the sort of thing that would not have been created
Would have
10 or
never
20
been.
years earlier.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
just a
yeah.
very unusual, strange project. And
I mean, you did get stuff like Cop Rock, but again, that's cops, right? You wouldn't get like a show
which I
about a
think
queer
Chase
poet.
didn't Chase work on Cop
Yeah,
Rock?
I believe so. I believe so.
Right.
But even back then, in like the weird TV era of the late 80s and 90s, when like Fox is being created, and that's like a little weird, you wouldn't get a show about a queer poet in the 19th century, right? That's like a comedy.
Right. And I guess
So
there's always weird shit like Alf.
there's weird
It was in the
shit, but
80s. And
I do think the
dinosaurs.
aperture had opened in a different way, because this is also the decade when Hollywood embraces diversity,
Right.
which from all accounts is now decidedly over. That Hollywood has turned its back on diversity in a significant way, and that's another interesting story that's connected, but
Right.
really not the main story we're telling.
Yeah, and you know, during like fat times, they're like, oh, okay, we'll bring in, you know, we'll have a special program for minority writers and stuff like this. And then
Mhm.
when the budgets constrict, it turns out that it's like the Ivy League kids stick around and everyone else is forced out. But she made this show that was critically lauded, but because it was on streaming, the ratings were opaque to everyone. But also, it's had like a just a totally miserable process, and they kept her in this sort of contingent state of not even like they finished the first season and weren't even sure if it was going to air at all. Like she thought maybe it would just be totally deleted because
Right,
Apple
which is also
owned it.
happens in Hollywood, right? Like a lot of the writers' responses, like sort of welcome to show running, which is true, but just doesn't. It's not right. It's not a way to
Right.
treat labor. Even if this is like proverbial Hollywood, it just reflects the sort of degraded condition of labor in Hollywood, to me.
Well, it seems like there's a long-standing stereotype that like the writer is treated the worst in Hollywood, and the Coen Brothers made fun of this. A lot of different parodic creations of Hollywood itself have mocked this idea that like the writer, especially as soon as the movie starts or movie or TV show starts being made, I guess more like a movie because that's like the finished script, and then like the writer is dead to everyone, and, and they're treated like dirt. So there's a long history of Hollywood treating writers quite badly. But the streaming era and the weirdness of the ratings or the numbers not being publicly accessible has like put more power into the studio's hands than before. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, like the studios really do always have the power. Um, but I would say, like, in GM, the GM managers had more power than labor. But in Uber, the Uber managers have all the power, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very simple way to and a similar thing has happened in Hollywood. Because again, one of the reasons I was interested in this story was because it's really a microcosm of the political economy as a whole. Like you wanted to be a journalist, right? What has happened to journalism between when you entered Yale in the early 2000s and today? It's been destroyed. It does not exist as a career. For the vast majority of people, the only way you could risk a job in journalism is if you have independent means or you do it as a hobby, right? Which is what my
Mhm.
buddy Jason Grote said about what he had done that in playwriting. And then he came out to Hollywood to try to have a more stable career, but now it's just basically playwriting. So I think like the arts and the life of the artist and the intellectual has been destroyed by monopolization and high finance.
Um, did you read William Derezowitz's work? I think it was it called not The Death of the Artist. Well, he had a book, and I
Yeah,
interviewed him on the
something
show
like
a
that.
couple years ago. But he wrote about how how hard it is over various domains for artists to make a living these days. Okay, so I wanted to ask about the critique that Max Reed made of your piece, which was basically like
Who's Max Reed again? Do you mind reminding me?
Max
I
Reed is a
probably fought
former
with him on Twitter, but
he's a former Gawker writer who now he was
oh,
at New York
this was a
Magazine and he has a newsletter called Read Max,
yeah.
and we'll link to his piece. And he was, I mean, he didn't disagree with your piece overall, but he was saying that in the pre-internet era, people were bored and had nothing to do, and so they would just go see a movie. They weren't expecting that much, but it was something to do. And now the like something to do amount of time that like people in America have has been consumed by smartphones and YouTube and
Wow, what an
so,
insight. I had
and
never
stuff like
thought
that.
of that. Oh my God, tell me
Okay.
more.
Well,
Jesus.
so the hollowing out.
You're telling me that people now spend time on their phones and social media? Hold on here, Mr. Reed. So,
Okay, so
okay, that's
so so
obvious. What was
the
that
entertainment
critique?
industry sort of used to have a monopoly time to
Okay, that's not true.
on
People
our
would do
time of
things
being
like
bored.
there was much like a social world. This is just like a 21st century millennial talking about a world that he didn't know. People did things like join associations, go to plays, hang out with friends, go out drinking much more than they do today. Much
Okay,
more.
well,
There was like an
that's
actual social world not
general like
alienated.
anomie, but if there was, I used to just, and we're about the same age. I used to just turn on the TV in the evenings and flip through. I don't know if anyone does that anymore, except maybe very old people. And so I was seeing commercials being broadcast by the stations and the cable channels. Um, and sometimes I would just leave it on and while I was doing something else. So that like world of just there's nothing else to do. Let's watch TV tonight, and we're gonna watch the big four networks or something on cable. Like that, like technology destroyed that. And similarly, like we're just gonna go see a movie because what else are we gonna do with our time? If you're like half of the box office receipts are from people like under age 25 who are sort of bored and don't have much to do. Yeah, so we have nothing else to do. Let's go see a movie. And now that we don't have much else to do, what should we do? Is like video games or watching TikTok or smoking e-cigarettes or something like that. So there's a lot more. So there was sort of that like monopoly on
Yeah, I just don't think
on
that's like an
survival
accurate.
entertainment.
I just don't think that's an accurate understanding of the sociability of the era he's referring to. I mean, frankly, like he's imagining that it was as alienated as it is today, and like just a lot of scholarly work that shows that wasn't the case. People would do things like go to Elks clubs, like
But I'm
it's
thinking more
like
like 80s 90s time, which was a glut time for Hollywood when they could put out trash and it would more or less find an audience who didn't have anything better to do.
yeah, sure. I'll admit the point that is not quite correct. Okay, how's that a criticism?
Well, if we're talking about the total like the total share of income that Hollywood gets, that income stream is gone and it's gone to. So he notes that like like YouTube creators are now reaping some of that
Yeah. I mean, I would
that
say that's like a
surplus, and he
broadly
says
part of
that the YouTube
entertainment.
creators should unionize in order to get the sort of
Sure.
collective bargaining rights against YouTube that writers and actors have
Well,
against the studios.
it's hard to do because like ultimately Hollywood is a mass cultural industry and we don't live in a mass culture anymore. Right. YouTube is which I believe a recent study came out that like 25% of all time spent on streaming services is spent watching YouTube. That just shows how popular it is if you consider YouTube a streaming service. But yeah, I mean, there's just not the mass money being thrown into Hollywood. To me, that's more important than like this time thing that I think is a misunderstanding of a lot of complex historical processes. It's just like the money isn't there anymore for a variety of reasons, mostly related to the destruction of the cable business and the decline of movies. And the destruction of the cable business was basically a self-inflicted wound by Hollywood, who tried to chase streaming in a very particular way. And the end of the cable movie business, by which I mean the theater business, was caused by just the decline of mass culture in general. And then also the end of how movies made money was also caused by the end of the home viewing, DVDs, VHSs, etc.
Okay. It is strange that the streaming channels seem to be recreating cable themselves by like teaming up with each other, and you can get like bundles now. And so it seems like where it's heading is that all the like cord cutting is just going to reassemble, except it's going to Netflix, Apple, Amazon
Right, except
instead
without the
of.
benefit of cable, like the socialization of cable. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
what do you mean the social, like the shared culture aspect?
No, who cares about that? I mean, like that's a different issue. I mean, cable had things like carriage fees, which that when everyone on a cable like that you would see on your cable box, they would get money from things like like a socialized distribution of money through carriage fees and other types of fees that were paid to the cable company as a whole, which were then distributed to the networks in various ways.
Okay, so like the bundling in some respect that like AMC and FX, because people wanted ESPN, like AMC and FX would get like some of the slough off of that stream because they were part of like the larger package, and that filtered down to making like Mad Men or something like that.
Yes, yeah, and there's like there were like various complex, like I had to learn all this for the piece, like complex calculations into how this went, but basically the have-nots would benefit to a certain degree, not as much as the haves, but they would benefit. And I think that is just totally going to not be there with the bundling of the streaming services. Not only that, you could, I think, reasonably worry that the bundling of the streaming services is basically a form of further monopolization. But instead of being at the level of the conglomerate like Comcast or WBD, it's at the level of the streaming service. So I wouldn't be surprised if these companies start like sharing executives and making decisions together, right? Which is another form of monopolization. I basically think we're screwed. And the only thing that's going to happen is government. The only thing that could save it is government regulation. But I think that's very, very hard.
Okay, well, let's hold that, and maybe we'll end with that after another question or two. So
Sure.
you
Yeah.
you
Yeah. Yeah.
quote you quote towards the end this famous saying by, is it William Goldman? Golding? William
Yeah.
Goldman.
Goldman.
Nobody knows anything, and he was a screenwriter, and he
Yes.
it was basically his point. I think was there's no way to know what will be a hit and what won't be a hit, and so the entertainment industry is very unpredictable because of that. And you could all the geniuses could think they're putting something together that like this is a surefire hit, and it will work, and things come out of left field that nobody expected that are big hits. Um, how do you see that playing out in this current system of monopoly ownership?
In terms of what playing out,
Like
the
in
type
terms of
of
creative output, because
oh
I mean, part of the piece is bemoaning that like the movies are all the same. It's all Marvel stuff. Like everyone is the same. It's all IP.
it's just going to continue, right? Because like this is all fake money anyway, and they don't care about the business. I think you're going to the positive spin is that maybe you'll get the rise of really interesting independent film and independent television as more interesting art is shut out of as interesting art is shut out of mainstream Hollywood. Maybe you'll see something that like happened in the 60s and 70s or 90s. Particularly 90s, that was more independent from my understanding than the 60s and the 70s. But probably a lot of that energy is going elsewhere, I would guess, to YouTube or to TikTok. And television itself is going to be an increasingly older person thing, like linear TV. I don't know if you saw that the statistics that were going around the other day, but the median age of an MTV viewer is like 50 or
I did see that.
51,
Yes, I
right?
did see
So
that.
like
And I said they should start
these are
playing
old
videos again.
forms.
That would be the way
Yeah.
to get the young people
Yeah. Yeah,
if they
these are
actually
old
played music
forms
videos.
that are going away. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
okay, so During the strike, there was an interesting podcast that Sean Clements, who's a comedian who's a co-host of Hollywood Handbook, was doing as a strike project, and it was called Subtitles On, and it was about watching movies that were about writers. So one of them, so they did like all the names are escaping me once again, Sunset Boulevard, and movies about movie writers largely, and a couple about regular writers. So Adaptation, they did Barton Fink, etc. And it's a very interesting podcast, and he's an entertaining guy. And in each one, he basically talks about his experience as a mid-level comedy writer in Hollywood. He's worked on some successful projects and other ones that failed after a season no one remembers. And he talks a lot about his interactions with like producers and studio executives and how like continually frustrating it was over and over again. And his era would be like late aughts to the present. And it made me think about that. Like nobody knows anything. So movie executives, it's like they're always getting replaced, and then there's a new one, and they're successful for a bit, and they get kicked out. And it seems like a job where it's highly unpredictable. It's not like picking stocks or something. It's much more unpredictable than that. And so the executives just have an incentive to be like, if their project is probably going to fail, their incentive is to be like, well, we did it because it seemed like this other thing that was successful. And so because Marvel was successful, we had more Marvel movies, but also like DC tried to replicate it, and the Universal monster characters, they tried and failed to replicate this like shared universe thing. So they can always be like, well, it worked this way. And maybe it used to be like a Tom Cruise movie worked before, so we'll have Tom Cruise again. And now it's more like, a superhero movie worked, so we'll have another superhero movie. And so there's like this radical uncertainty, it seems like, in the industry about what will work. And so all they can do
this is why,
say,
by the way, it's not a good business for finance, right? It makes sense to invest in 10 Uber companies because if you hit one, you become a trillionaire. It doesn't make sense to invest in 10 movies because even if that one big hit, it's not going to be that big a hit. Hollywood is a relatively, it's an industry of hits. It's an industry with a lot of losses, and even the hits aren't that gigantic. Like you compare like Titanic to Uber, like the biggest, it's not even comparable.
Which,
so this
makes
also
it strange
relates to Aria.
Something like Apple would want to get into the business.
It's not that strange because this is where your love for capitalism comes apart, because there hasn't been good places to invest in this economy since the 1970s. Have you heard about this idea of the falling rate of profit? This is something that Marx said, and it's 100% true, which is that over time, there's going to be less profitable places for capitalists to invest. Think about it. When you're building literally American cities in the 19th century and the 20th century, you could make a ton of money from things like steel, right? But now that the cities are built, you need to do things like deindustrialize and find cheaper labor abroad. But now that has been, you've already done that, and there's really nowhere to go in terms of, you could automate labor, but that's sort of an internal process. Where is high finance going to invest? It invested in tech. Then the tech balloon collapsed, and they got all this free money. And like, where do you go? The journalism and Hollywood, two shitty businesses, basically, that have never been invested by high finance because they're not good businesses. The only reason that they went there is because there's nowhere to fucking invest in this economy anymore, which is why capitalism eats itself, as Marx said.
That's interesting. I'll have to ponder that some more.
No,
yeah, it certainly doesn't seem
literally it's a suicide machine. It's literally eating its own self and destroying the planet in the process.
And so in the Hollywood sense, you note that like it used to be that writers would be sort of mentored and molded by the system and like work the way up to become showrunners, and that's what happened with the Davids and stuff. Whereas now with the mini rooms and stuff, there's no like sense of mentorship or sort of like learning on the job, and eventually you'll reach the top. Like now everyone is seen as disposable. So what do you think? I mean, it used to be like there was no way an ordinary person could make a movie. And then even if like Kevin Smith wanted to make a movie in the 90s, like he had to buy the film. And so it cost like $30,000. Like now anyone could make something that looks more or less like a movie using their smartphone and a computer. But like that hasn't resulted in, there hasn't been a great movie, as far as I know, made by someone doing that. Like people who are doing that are doing TikTok dances and, like live streaming themselves playing video games and stuff like that. Like, do you think the falling cost of the like production technology and the fact that anyone, you don't need a studio a lot, you don't need film by the mile and stuff like that, like could that lead to a creative resurgence, or is it just going to be like
sure, maybe
the YouTube crap?
Doesn't really seem to have happened. And I don't think YouTube is crap, right? I mean, I think there's actually probably there's a lot of really good stuff on you. Obviously, there's a lot of crap because again, as we agreed, most art is shit most of the time. There's a lot of good stuff on YouTube as well. My guess is movies in particular are just a less vital medium for people who are younger. That is just it's not. I don't think it's ever going to become as opera because I don't think like opera. Sometimes you hear that because I don't think the barrier to entry is as high for a movie. Like operas are really long. They're in foreign languages. They're sort of like a totally a different form of storytelling in a way that movies still are legible to people, but they're clearly not the most vital art form of the 21st century. All the big movie guys, why did all the greatest movies or a lot of movies that people consider to be the greatest of all time were made by baby boomers because they were in the exact media, like in literal the medium in the history of movies. Like they start in the 70s, you figure movies really start in the 20s and they're kind of ending in the 2020s. They're in the literal center of that. And so that's not going to be replaced. That because that's like a larger macro thing that like an individual can't you can't make as vital a movie in 2024 2025 because movies are not as vital anymore, right? Just like if you wrote an opera, it's never going to be as vital as it would have been in the 17th century or the 18th century.
Right.
And you'll that's true for movies and TV. I think that's a little bit less true because I do think TV has more of a cultural resonance, but I wouldn't be surprised if that trend's older as well, and that there are new forms of content that begin to take off in the coming decades.
Right. And the cultural phenomenon of last year was Taylor Swift's concert tour, which what I mean, she did turn it into a movie, but like that is a non-replicable experience of going to a
Yeah,
stadium with 50,000 of your fellow Swifties and stuff. And so that sort of mass culture still exists to some extent. And I mean that I guess that was like the most successful music tour in history, but yeah,
for
it's
sure.
not a movie and it's not accessible to everyone because tickets are very expensive and and even hard to get. And this actually, just yesterday, the Justice Department said they were gonna try to dismantle Ticketmaster, which is
As Pearl Jam said.
not directly connected to Hollywood, but sort of an
Yeah,
adjacent
maybe they'll
industry.
do yeah.
Yeah, what did you think of that when you heard that was
Yeah,
happening?
that's good news. Maybe there will be some sort of turn toward deregulation. I mean, that would be sorry, to re-regulation. That would be very nice. I'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it seems like it has to get like people like Ticketmaster became universally loathed and pissed off the most popular, like powerful singer on the planet before the Justice Department took action. But yeah, there is some sort of pushback there at least. And so okay, so if you were running either the Justice Department or the FCC or the FTC, and you were trying to improve the situation for consumers and producers of screen entertainment, what would you do?
I mean, I would re-regulate the industry. It's not even a difficult solution here. It's just not going to happen because that's not
But
the world we live in.
what would the re-regulation like look like? Like you would split them into smaller things, and Apple could no longer Apple Plus would either be
Yeah, Comcast can't own 20 networks and studios. I mean, it's very simple. Those should be independent businesses. Boom, re-regulated.
okay, but you not a regulation in the sense of like this is just an antitrust sort of thing. Like or would you like would there be more actual like regulations in the way that like the airline industry was regulated in the 70s or the pre 1970s? Like
Oh, I
what
mean,
would
there should be I mean, like management is just way more powerful than labor. That should probably not be allowed. You basically shouldn't be allowed to have one side of an industry totally organized and one side of an industry basically not organized. That's not really allowed. I mean, there are the unions, but there's just when an individual writer goes into a studio, he's an individual writer, she's an individual writer, they're an individual writer. So there should be a lot more regulation that I don't think I really have time to get into now because I unfortunately must go. But I think something like that would be helpful.
right? And it is the WGA and the SGA are in the terms of American unions are like strong. Like you need, if you
Very
want to be in
strong,
a
yeah.
movie, you have to. It's like a closed shop, right? Like you need to be a member if you want to like have a line in a movie or something like that. So
There's
they're
ways to
powerful.
use non-union labor, but yeah, I mean, just as a general rule, then yeah, for sure.
And the trade, the trades people who work behind the scenes are also unionized, and they have more power than in the average American industry as well. Okay,
Yep.
well, there's stuff we didn't get to, but I would encourage people to check out the article, which will be linked in the show notes. And do you want to mention any of your other projects for people who are interested in following your current work?
Check out my podcast, American Prestige. That would be the one to check out. Please
okay, so a link to that will be in the show notes as well. Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for coming on, and congrats on the article. Thanks to all the viewers and listeners. We are stuck in this capitalist hell system, but you can still rate and review and tell your friends. If you still have any friends, this capitalist anomie hasn't destroyed your social network, you can tell your friends about this podcast, Culture Determined, and do all sorts of fun stuff like that. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you to the listeners out there. We'll see you again next time.